The county fair had rolled into town the way it always did, with trucks arriving at dawn, rides unfolding like skeletons being given flesh, and the smell of fried dough drifting across the fields before the gates even opened. For the people of this small rural community, it was the highlight of the year, a weekend where families gathered, teenagers flirted beneath the glow of neon lights, and farmers put aside their work for a night of laughter and noise. On that humid August evening, the fairground was alive with sound, children screaming as the tilt-a-whirl spun, music blasting from tinny speakers, and vendors calling out for customers. Somewhere in the middle of it all was a boy who didn't stand out, a boy who had come with friends just like everyone else, but who by the end of the night would no longer be seen again. He was 16, quiet by nature, the kind of kid who blended in rather than drew attention. Friends described him as shy but reliable, someone who didn't cause trouble and who almost always made it home on time. That night he'd been reluctant to go to the fair at first, but his friends persuaded him, reminding him it only came once a year. They bought wristbands, rode the Ferris wheel, and wandered the midway, moving between bright lights and shadowed corners where the crowd pressed close. Nothing about the evening seemed unusual. He laughed with them, ate a corn dog, and kept checking the time on his phone, as though mindful of curfews. By every outward appearance, it was an ordinary summer night. But ordinary nights can shift without warning. As the fair wore on, people split off in groups, some heading for rides, others for the food stalls. At some point he drifted away from the circle of friends. One remembered seeing him near the game booths tossing a ring at a bottle. Another thought he was walking toward the parking lot as if to take a call. No one saw him leave. When the rides began shutting down near midnight, his absence wasn't alarming, at least not at first. It was common for teenagers to slip away early, catch a ride with someone else, or walk home on their own. His friends assumed he had gone ahead. They gathered their things and went home, never realizing they were the last to see him. At his family's house just outside of town, the porch light was left on the way it always was when he was out late. His parents waited, not concerned in the beginning. Midnight became 1, 1 became 2, and by 3 in the morning they were pacing, dialing his phone again and again, each call going straight to voicemail. Panic didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, with every unanswered ring and every car that passed outside without slowing in the driveway. His mother walked circles through the house, checking the windows as if he might appear out of the darkness, while his father drove into town, retracing the route between their home and the fairgrounds, scanning for any sign of him. There was nothing. By dawn, the house was filled with dread. Sleep hadn't come for either parent, and when the sun rose over the cornfields, it brought no relief. His bed was still neatly made from the morning before. His shoes sat by the door. His backpack was leaning against the wall where he had left it. There was no note, no hint that he had planned to go anywhere but the fair. His parents called his closest friends, one after another, but none of them knew where he had gone. Each had assumed he was with someone else. For the first time, they realized that no one had seen him leave, and no one could say where he might be. The fairgrounds, just hours earlier alive with noise and color, were now empty fields littered with cups and ticket stubs. Workers hosed down pavement, swept debris, and began packing up rides for the next town. The boy's parents drove there in desperation, circling the grounds, searching the parking lot, calling his name into the morning air. It felt impossible that in a place so full of people, he could simply vanish. Yet as they asked around, vendors, maintenance crews, security, no one remembered him after midnight. He was gone, and the fair had already moved on. By late morning, they contacted the police. At first, the response was measured, calm. Teenagers, officers reminded them, sometimes stayed out late or left without telling anyone. But his parents knew this wasn't that. He had never once stayed out all night. He was responsible, careful, the type of boy who always texted if he was running late. This wasn't him. As the hours stretched into a full day, law enforcement began to see it too. Something was wrong. The boy hadn't just wandered off. He hadn't run away. He had disappeared in the middle of the county fair with hundreds of witnesses and not a single trace. The first official search would be launched before nightfall, with volunteers combing the fields and deputies sweeping the fairgrounds for anything left behind. But in those first long hours, before the town rallied and the media arrived, There was only the crushing realization inside one small family home that a boy had gone out for a night at the fair and never made it back. And as the day faded into evening and hope shifted into fear, the question that no one could yet answer began to take hold. How could someone vanish in plain sight? The first morning without him bled into the first full day, and by then the urgency was undeniable. Police set up a command post near the fairgrounds, a makeshift hub in the community center parking lot where maps were unrolled across tables and volunteers signed in with names and phone numbers. Deputies walked the perimeter of the grounds, radio chatter filling the air, while detectives moved through the crowds of lingering vendors and fair employees, asking the same questions again and again. Had anyone seen him near the rides? Did anyone notice him leaving? Did a single person see him step into a car? No one had. It was as though, in a place overflowing with people, his presence had dissolved into nothing. By mid-afternoon, the search widened beyond the fair itself. Volunteers in jeans and work boots pushed through tall cornfields on the edge of town, calling his name in voices that carried over the stalks. Others moved along the riverbank, scanning for anything out of place: shoes, clothing, even footprints. Dogs were brought in, handlers urging them forward with scent articles taken from the boy's bedroom. The animals strained at their leashes, noses to the ground, circling the parking lot and midway before pulling toward the tree line just beyond the lights. But once they entered the woods, the scent evaporated. The dog stopped, confused, the trail broken. It left investigators unsettled. In theory, he should have left a trace, but here there was none. The fairground became a landscape of contradiction. On one side, crews dismantled rides and packed trucks, moving on to the next town as though nothing had happened. On the other, police strung yellow tape and marked off sections with stakes, photographing every square of dirt, every cigarette butt, every discarded soda can. Parents from the community held their own children closer, watching officers sift through trash bins and search beneath bleachers. A sense of disbelief hung over everyone. How could a teenager vanish from such a public place without anyone noticing? As the hours dragged on, rumors began to ripple through the crowd of searchers. Some whispered that he must have run away, that maybe he had problems no one knew about. Others suggested fights or arguments, strangers lurking in the shadows near the parking lot. Investigators couldn't ignore any possibility, so they chased each theory, questioning anyone who might have had contact with him that night. Ride operators were pulled aside and asked about the last groups to board. Vendors were asked if they had seen him stop at their stands. No one could recall anything significant. He was there, and then he wasn't. The boy's friends were questioned separately, each interview recorded and compared. They repeated what they knew. They had been together most of the night, laughing, eating, playing games, until sometime near the end when they simply lost track of him. One friend said he thought the boy had walked toward the parking lot to take a phone call. Another said he saw him near the edge of the rides. But the timelines didn't line up neatly. Each detail was blurred, distorted by the haze of memory and the chaos of the fair. Nothing could be pinned down with certainty, leaving detectives with fragments instead of a clear picture. Nightfall returned with no answers. Flashlights swept across the fields, their beams bouncing off leaves and tree trunks as teams searched deeper into the woods. Boats were launched into the river, spotlights cutting across the water. Helicopters hovered overhead, thermal cameras scanning the landscape below. Every method available was deployed, and yet the result was the same: nothing. The boy was not there. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him. Back at home, his family endured the unendurable. His mother sat by the phone, refusing to sleep, jumping at every call that came through. His father returned to the fairgrounds each night, retracing the same paths he had walked the evening before, his flashlight cutting through empty fields now silent without the sounds of carnival music. Neighbors delivered food that went untouched, offered words that sounded hollow against the reality of the situation. Hope fought with dread in every passing hour. By the third day, the town was fully mobilized. Flyers were printed with his photograph, stapled to telephone poles, handed out at gas stations, and posted on store windows. His school organized groups of students to search ditches along rural roads. Local farmers drove their fields in pickup trucks, scanning the ground as though expecting to find him collapsed in the rows. Each effort ended the same way: with nothing new to report. The absence was all anyone had, and it grew heavier with each search that turned up empty. Detectives began to say what no one wanted to hear, that it was possible he had left with someone, that he had stepped willingly or unwillingly into a car. The parking lot became the focus. Officers marked tire tracks, logged license plates from those who had been there, but thousands had come and gone that night. Any one of them could have been the link, and any one of them could have been meaningless. With no witness to narrow it down, the parking lot became a void of possibilities. As the first week closed, the search parties thinned, volunteers exhausted, resources stretched. The boy's photo was now on the evening news, his story told to neighboring counties and beyond. Yet the central truth remained unchanged. Hundreds of people had been within feet of him at the fair, and not a single person could say where he went next. It left investigators staring into a mystery that should have been impossible. A teenager surrounded by witnesses had disappeared in plain sight, and the longer they looked without answers, the deeper the sense of unease settled in. The fair was over, the rides gone, but something in that parking lot had swallowed a boy whole. The first week of searching gave way to the second, and with it came the flood of tips. Calls poured into the sheriff's office from surrounding towns, each one claiming to have seen someone who matched the missing boy's description. A clerk at a gas station swore he had spotted him standing by the pumps with a backpack slung over his shoulder. A truck driver reported a teenager thumbing for a ride along the highway, looking tired and anxious. A diner waitress said a quiet boy sat alone in a booth, barely touching his food before slipping out the door. Each sighting was written down, cataloged, and passed to detectives who, despite mounting fatigue, pursued them all. At first, the family clung to these tips like lifelines. Each one suggested their son might still be out there, walking roads, trying to make his way back. But hope collapsed quickly under the weight of disappointment. Detectives checked surveillance tapes at the gas station. The boy on the screen was taller, his hair darker. They tracked down the highway hitchhiker, only to discover he was another runaway whose family had already reported him missing in a different county. The boy seen at the diner turned out to be a stranger from out of state, a traveler who bore only the faintest resemblance. Each lead built anticipation, then fell apart under scrutiny, leaving behind only the ache of another dead end. The longer the case stretched on, the more rumors swirled. Some insisted he had run away, that maybe life at home wasn't as picture-perfect as his parents wanted people to believe. Others whispered about carnival workers, strangers who had passed through town and vanished as quickly as he did. A handful of kids from school claimed he had been talking about leaving, about finding something bigger than this small town could offer, but when detectives pressed, no one could recall exact words. It was always someone who thought they heard or remembered him saying, never anything certain. Rumor blurred with imagination until investigators couldn't separate fact from small-town gossip. Detectives pursued theories with equal parts determination and dread. They checked bus depots and train stations, scanning ticket logs for his name. They interviewed long-haul drivers, searching for any who might have given a teenager a ride that night. They even spoke with social workers in nearby cities, hoping he had surfaced in shelters or runaway hotlines. Each attempt ended in silence. No one matching his description had purchased tickets, checked into shelters, or reached out for help. It was as if he had been erased. Back at the fairgrounds, the scene lingered in eerie contrast. What had been alive with neon lights and voices was now empty fields, a scattering of litter pressed into dirt. Parents who once brought their children for funnel cakes and rides now drove past the grounds with unease, eyes avoiding the vacant lot where the boy was last known to be. The place carried an unshakable weight, a reminder of a night that ended in absence. Some people refused to go near it at all, saying it felt wrong to step where something so unexplainable had happened. The fair had packed up and moved on, but for the town, the Midway had become a scar. For the family, weeks stretched like years. His mother sat in his room at night, clutching his belongings, replaying every memory for hidden clues. His father scanned highways with binoculars, pulling off at rest stops and diners, asking strangers if they had seen a boy who looked like his son. They followed up on their own tips, sometimes driving hours away, desperate to be the first to find him if police overlooked something. Each trip ended with nothing, and each time the ride home was heavier than the last. Hope was slowly being replaced by exhaustion, though neither parent could admit it out loud. Detectives kept the case active, but with every false lead, their momentum faltered. Files grew thick with reports and witness statements that all led nowhere. The media moved on to other stories, leaving only the family and the closest neighbors still pushing. What had begun with hundreds of volunteers dwindled to a handful, the energy of the community shifting back to daily life. But the absence never loosened its grip. For those who knew him, and for those who searched, the unanswered question hung heavier than any rumor. If he hadn't run away and no one had taken him far, then where was he? As weeks dragged into a month, the absence of answers gave way to something darker. In the beginning, neighbors had gathered to support the family, bringing casseroles, joining search parties, and hanging flyers. But when each search ended empty-handed, the tone in town shifted. Whispers began to circulate, soft at first, then louder, weaving their way through diners, barbershops, and church pews. If the boy hadn't run away, then someone must have taken him, and the list of possibilities grew longer with every retelling. Attention soon fell on the carnival workers. They were outsiders, transient employees who arrived in town with the fair and disappeared just as quickly. By the time detectives began to probe deeper, most of them were already gone, traveling to the next county or the next state. Locals recalled uneasy details in hindsight: one worker who stared too long at kids waiting for rides, another who was seen loitering near the parking lot at closing time. Some residents swore a group of workers packed up in a rush the morning after the disappearance, pulling away before sunrise, as though eager to leave questions behind. Whether those memories were accurate or reshaped by fear, no one could say for sure, but suspicion was firmly planted. Others pointed fingers closer to home. Fights at the fair were not uncommon, especially among teenagers fueled by adrenaline and sugar. Rumors spread of a scuffle behind the food stands, of boys arguing near the edge of the lot. No one could place the missing boy in those fights, but whispers turned possibility into certainty in the minds of some. Parents repeated stories they had heard secondhand, embellishing details until they became warnings. For some, it was easier to believe in a fight gone wrong than in a stranger sweeping into town and vanishing with a boy. Then there were the reports of strangers, faces people claimed not to recognize, men seen standing too long at the edge of the lot or lingering by the tree line as the fair wound down. Some swore a dark sedan idled near the exit that night, headlights off, waiting for someone. Others remembered a man with a limp asking about directions. Each account was vague, colored by hindsight and uncertainty, but they fueled the growing unease. No one could dismiss them, because all anyone knew for certain was that a boy had entered the fair and never left. That uncertainty bred paranoia. Neighbors began eyeing one another differently. Some quietly wondered if the answer lay not with strangers at all, but with someone within their own town. Old grudges resurfaced, odd behaviors were magnified. A man who lived alone and rarely spoke became the subject of gossip. A teenager with a history of petty theft was suddenly a suspect in whispered conversations. Even friends of the missing boy were not spared, their stories scrutinized, their words repeated until doubt crept in. What if someone they knew had been involved? What if the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along? For the family, these rumors added a cruel new layer to their grief. While they clung to hope of finding their son, they also had to hear strangers speculate about his fate, sometimes suggesting he had chosen to leave, other times insinuating that his friends or even his parents knew more than they admitted. Pain mixed with anger, and their home became both a place of mourning and a fortress against the judgment outside. They avoided grocery stores, avoided community events, unable to endure the sidelong glances and hushed voices that followed them everywhere. The fairground itself became a symbol of suspicion. Parents began warning their children about the dangers of strangers, telling them never to wander alone. Some said they would never let their kids attend the fair again, that it had become cursed ground. Others believed the opposite, that the truth was buried there somewhere, and that one day it would come to light. For now, all that remained was speculation. Theories multiplied, twisting with each telling, but none of them led to evidence. The only thing growing faster than the unanswered questions was the distance between neighbors who no longer trusted one another. The boy's disappearance had shattered the family in ways neither parent could have imagined. At first, they moved through those early days on instinct alone, clinging to each other in the chaos of police searches and interviews, leaning on hope as though it were the only thing keeping them upright. But as the weeks turned into months with no answers, that fragile hope began to take on different shapes. For his father, it became an obsession. Every night, after work, or often instead of it, he returned to the fairgrounds with a flashlight in hand, retracing the same paths his son had walked, scouring the empty lot for any detail the searchers might have missed. He walked along the riverbank, pushed through the woods, and stood for hours in the parking lot staring at the asphalt, as if it might give up its secret if he just stared long enough. He came home late, mud on his boots, exhausted but restless, only to repeat the cycle the next day. His mother's grief took another form. She retreated into the house, guarding his bedroom like it was a shrine. She refused to let anyone move his belongings. The shoes by the door stayed in their place, the backpack still leaned against the wall, and the bed remained neatly made as he had left it that morning. She spent long hours sitting on the edge of that bed, scrolling through old text messages, replaying voicemails just to hear his voice. In her mind, leaving the room untouched was an act of faith, proof that she believed he might still walk back through the door. To change anything would be admitting defeat, and she wasn't ready for that. The weight of constant media attention only deepened the strain. Reporters parked outside their home, knocking on their door at all hours, eager for quotes, for photos, for anything that could push the story further. At first, the coverage felt like an ally, a way to keep his face and name alive in the public eye. But the longer the story lingered, the more it turned invasive. Commentators speculated about family dynamics, questioning whether the boy had run away. Online forums dissected the father's nightly searches, painting him as desperate at best, suspicious at worst. The mother's quiet grief was reinterpreted as cold detachment. Strangers who had never met them began to question their every move, and those questions carried back into the community, fueling even more rumors. Cruel whispers took hold. Some said the boy had left willingly, that maybe he had been unhappy at home and simply chosen freedom. Others accused the parents themselves of hiding something, pointing to inconsistencies in interviews or the father's late-night wanderings. Even people they had once called friends began keeping their distance, uncertain where the truth ended and gossip began. The couple, once surrounded by support, now felt the walls closing in, trapped not only by their grief, but by the suspicion that clung to them. The marriage strained under the pressure. Conversations turned into arguments, and silence often stretched longer than words. The father insisted on continuing his searches, convinced the answer was still out there waiting to be found. The mother clung to routine inside the house, unwilling to confront the possibility that he was gone forever. Each coped in isolation, unable to bridge the widening gap between them. Neighbors saw them as distant, cold, their grief pulling them apart instead of together. Behind closed doors, the emptiness in their home grew louder with every passing day. For the extended family, there was little they could do but watch. Relatives brought meals that went uneaten, tried to help with household chores, only to be met with resistance. Friends suggested therapy. Church groups offered prayer circles, but the parents refused. To accept help felt like giving into a reality they couldn't bear to name. And so, they sank deeper into their own worlds, the father pacing fields under the moonlight, the mother sitting silently in a room frozen in time, both of them bound by the same loss but drifting further apart in how they carried it. As the first year without their son drew to a close, the house that had once been full of ordinary noise, slamming doors, laughter, the shuffle of footsteps on the stairs, was suffocatingly quiet. Holidays passed in silence. Birthdays marked by candles lit in solitude. The boy's absence had become a presence of its own, filling every corner of their lives. And though the search had not stopped, though the case remained active, the family felt caged by grief, by rumor, and by the gnawing suspicion that the truth might never come to light. The fairgrounds, once a place of joy, now loomed over them as a symbol of everything lost. Months had passed when detectives stumbled upon something they had missed in the earliest days of the investigation. In the chaos of gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and conducting ground searches, thousands of hours of surveillance footage from the fairgrounds had been collected. Some of it came from vendors who had mounted their own cameras near stalls, some from portable security towers rented by the county, and some from nearby businesses whose parking lots bordered the fair. Much of it was grainy, poorly lit, or trained on areas of little importance. Still, as winter crept closer and the case grew colder, investigators began combing back through every second of it, desperate for something, anything, that had slipped through unnoticed. It was a detective assigned to the task who noticed the flicker of movement near the edge of a frame. The camera was mounted high on a light pole, overlooking the outer stretch of the parking lot. At first glance, the footage showed nothing more than a sea of cars beneath harsh overhead lights. But around 12:07 a.m., a lone figure appeared near the far edge of the lot. He was walking slowly, almost cautiously, toward an area where the glow of the fairground lights thinned into shadow. The figure was slender, dressed in clothing consistent with what the missing boy had been last seen wearing, and though the camera's resolution was poor, detectives agreed it was him. For a moment, it was a relief to finally see proof, a visual confirmation of his last movements, but that relief quickly curdled into unease as they watched what came next. He walked until he reached the edge of the lot near a line of trees where the pavement bled into dirt. Then, in a single step, he moved into the darkness and was gone. There was no car pulling up, no shadow of another figure, no visible struggle. One frame he was there, and in the next, the spot was empty. He did not reappear anywhere else on camera. Detectives replayed the sequence dozens of times, freezing the moment before he vanished, enhancing the image in futile attempts to draw clarity from the blur. They searched adjacent footage from other cameras, hoping to catch him from a different angle, but none overlapped. That small stretch of parking lot existed in a blind spot, partially lit, poorly covered, easy for anyone to slip into without being seen. What unsettled investigators most was not what the footage showed, but what it didn't. If someone had approached him, if he had entered a vehicle, if anything had happened, it remained hidden in the one corner where cameras failed to reach. The discovery reignited the investigation. Officers descended on the parking lot once more, this time focusing on the precise area the boy had entered. They brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, even metal detectors to probe beneath the soil. For days, the lot was combed and recombed, yet nothing surfaced, no trace of clothing, no disturbed earth, no physical evidence to explain what had happened in those final seconds. The asphalt was cracked and weathered, littered with debris from months of use, but it yielded no answers. For the family, the footage was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it confirmed their son had been alive and moving of his own will in his last known moments. On the other, it was a chilling and incomplete picture, a window into the mystery without any explanation of what lay on the other side. His mother stared at the still images obsessively, memorizing the outline of his body in the harsh glow of the lights, desperate to read something, fear, hesitation, intent, in the way he carried himself. His father grew consumed with the blind spot, convinced the truth lingered just out of frame. He visited the lot at night, standing where the cameras could no longer see, staring into the same stretch of darkness his son had disappeared into. Media outlets seized on the footage, airing it repeatedly on the evening news, slowing it down, circling his figure with red markers, speculating endlessly on what might have happened beyond the edge of the frame. To the public, it was haunting proof of how someone could vanish in plain sight. To investigators, maddeningly incomplete evidence, a record that ended too soon, offering no closure and no clear path forward. In the months that followed, the image of him walking toward the shadows became the defining symbol of the case. It was plastered across missing posters, news articles, and online forums, where strangers dissected every pixel in search of hidden details. Some believed he had been lured into a waiting car just beyond the frame. Others suggested he had gone willingly, meeting someone he trusted in that unlit corner. A few whispered darker theories, that something had happened in those shadows that left no trace at all. Whatever the truth, the footage froze the boy's story in a single, unbearable moment. A teenager stepping out of the light, swallowed by the dark, never to be seen again. The first anniversary arrived with candles and prayers. Neighbors gathered at the fairgrounds, standing in the very parking lot where he had last been seen. His parents spoke softly, their voices trembling as they thanked everyone for their support, but behind their words was exhaustion that had been building for 12 months. The search had not stopped in their hearts, but the investigation had slowed to a crawl. Detectives rotated off the case, reassigned to newer crimes, while only a thin thread of effort remained. A few officers who still checked tips, a file that grew thicker but no closer to resolution. Yet the fair returned, as it always did, and its arrival tore the wound open again. The midway lit up with the same neon glow, music played from the same rides, and children laughed in the same places where search dogs had once pulled at leashes. For some in town, the return of the fair was unbearable. They couldn't stomach the smell of fried dough or the sound of carnival games without remembering the night a boy had vanished. Those families stopped attending, choosing to drive past the grounds with windows up, their eyes fixed forward. For others, life continued, the fair an unshakable tradition that pressed on despite the shadow hanging over it. But no matter how brightly the lights flashed, the lot at the edge remained dark, a place people glanced at uneasily as they parked their cars. For his parents, the years were measured not in seasons but in absence. The boy's mother kept his room intact through the first 5 years, unwilling to move even a single object. The father's nightly searches faded into weekly ones, then into rare visits marked by silence and tears. Hope still lingered, but it grew quieter, a dull ache rather than a raging fire. Every birthday was marked by an empty chair, every holiday by the thought of what age he would have been. Time moved forward for everyone else, but inside their home it remained the night of the fair, frozen and unending. As the second, third, and fourth anniversaries passed, the vigils grew smaller. What had once drawn crowds dwindled to a few dozen supporters, mostly close friends and relatives. Media attention faded, replaced by fresher stories of tragedy. Online discussions moved on. New residents in town learned of the case only in passing, from whispers at grocery stores or mentions at school. For them, it was history, something that belonged to the past rather than an open wound. But for those who had been there that night, it remained raw, the memory of how a boy could vanish among hundreds still gnawing at them. By the 7th year, even tips had dried up. Where once the sheriff's office fielded calls weekly, now months could pass without a single lead. Detectives admitted privately that there was little more to be done. Without new evidence, without someone stepping forward, the case was stuck in place. Files sat in storage, stacked alongside other unsolved disappearances, each one a story waiting in silence. Officially, the boy's case remained open. Unofficially, it was frozen, waiting for a miracle that never came. The town itself carried the burden differently. Some residents avoided the fair entirely, declaring it cursed, the place where something terrible had happened. Others used it as a grim reminder, warning their children not to wander, to stay close, to never trust strangers. Still others grew resentful, tired of the way the case lingered like a cloud over their community. They wanted to move on, even if it meant leaving the boy's story behind. But moving on didn't erase the unease. Every August, as the first trucks arrived to set up the rides, the whispers returned, and with them, the question that had never been answered. What really happened in that parking lot? For his family, silence became their reality. His mother stopped doing interviews, stopped attending vigils, and rarely left the house. His father grew quieter too, his energy spent after years of chasing dead ends. Their home became a place where grief lived permanently, where photos on the walls never aged and memories replaced the boy who had once filled the rooms with noise. The laughter of neighborhood children passing by was a cruel echo of what had been stolen. By the 10th anniversary, the case was formally listed among the county's unsolved missing persons. It was not a decision marked by ceremony but by paperwork, a line entered into records to acknowledge what had long been true. For the family, it was another kind of loss, a confirmation that the system had given up, that their son's disappearance had been reduced to a file number gathering dust. The fair arrived that summer like it always did, lights flashing, crowds gathering, music blaring. But beneath the noise, there was a silence that no one could ignore. A silence that had grown for a decade and shown no signs of ending. The boy had stepped into the shadows one night, and the world had carried on without him. 14 years had passed since the night he vanished, long enough that many in town had stopped expecting answers. The fair still returned every summer, though its glow felt muted, haunted by memory. The lot where he had last been seen was cracked now, its asphalt buckling with age, weeds pushing through gaps. It was this deterioration that finally brought a construction crew to the site, hired to repave the fairground's sprawling parking area before the next season opened. On a gray morning, with machinery grinding and shovels breaking through layers of old pavement, the ground that had held its silence for more than a decade finally gave something back. One of the workers noticed it first. His shovel struck something solid, not stone but metal, and when he cleared the dirt, he found a rusted bicycle lock half buried. At first, it seemed unremarkable, just another piece of discarded junk pressed beneath years of asphalt. But beside it was something else, a strip of faded fabric, frayed at the edges, its color dulled by soil. The worker pulled back instinctively, recognizing that what they had uncovered didn't belong in a parking lot. When another strike of the shovel exposed what looked like bone, the entire project came to a halt. Police were called immediately. Within an hour, patrol cars and unmarked vehicles swarmed the site. Yellow tape was strung across the lot, heavy machinery silenced as the construction crew stood at a distance, shaken by what they had unearthed. Investigators crouched in the dirt, brushing carefully with gloved hands until the outline of skeletal remains emerged from the shallow ground. 14 years of questions seemed to converge in that moment, the disbelief that what so many had searched for lay beneath their feet all along. The discovery was both shocking and devastating. The remains were incomplete, fragile bones pressed close to the surface, as if someone had buried them hastily without care. The torn fabric was collected, tagged, and bagged as evidence alongside the rusted lock. Detectives speculated aloud, wondering whether the lock had belonged to the boy's bicycle, though his had never been reported missing. Each item was treated as a potential key to the mystery, yet each raised more questions than it answered. News spread through town before nightfall. By evening, the fairground parking lot was crowded again, but this time with cameras, reporters, and neighbors gathered in stunned silence. For years, the lot had been a place people avoided, muttering about its curse as they parked their cars on its edges. Now those whispers had crystallized into something tangible, something undeniable. The boy who had vanished in the crowd had never left. He had been here the whole time, hidden beneath the very place where hundreds had once searched for him. For his family, the call from investigators was both a relief and a breaking point. After 14 years of imagining every possible scenario, abduction, runaway, a life lived in secret, they were told his remains had been found just yards from where he was last seen. His mother collapsed upon hearing it, unable to process that he had been so close all along. His father drove to the site and stood behind the police tape, staring into the lot until officers gently asked him to leave. The confirmation was the closure they had begged for, yet it came in the cruelest form. Investigators treated the area like a crime scene frozen in time. Forensic teams documented every inch, photographing the bones, measuring soil layers, and marking the positions of each fragment. Specialists sifted through dirt, searching for anything left behind. Jewelry, keys, traces of fabric, even tire impressions fossilized beneath the asphalt. The rusted lock was bagged for later analysis, its corroded metal holding the possibility of fingerprints long erased by years underground. The fabric was sent to labs in hopes of linking it to clothing worn the night of the fair. Despite the flurry of activity, one question loomed larger than all the rest. How had the body gone undiscovered during the original search? The parking lot had been combed dozens of times, officers and volunteers walking its length with flashlights, cadaver dogs sniffing at its edges. Yet the boy had lain just beneath the surface, undetected. Detectives theorized that he had been buried hastily in a shallow grave, then covered by asphalt during routine repairs in the years that followed, entombed beneath the pavement that thousands had walked over without knowing. By the end of the week, the lot no longer looked like a construction site. It had transformed into a place of investigation, floodlights illuminating the ground through the night as forensic teams worked in shifts. The town that had grown used to silence was suddenly confronted with the truth they had stopped expecting. A boy had vanished from a fair, and 14 years later, The ground itself had finally spoken. But while the discovery gave an answer to where he had been, it opened a darker void of questions about how he got there and who had put him there in the first place. The remains were rushed from the parking lot to the state forensic lab under heavy guard, sealed in evidence bags and handled with painstaking care. For 14 years, the boy had been a name in a missing persons file, his image printed on flyers and tacked to telephone poles. Now, for the first time, there was something tangible, something investigators could test, measure, and examine. Within days, DNA analysis confirmed what everyone already suspected. The bones belonged to the teenager who had vanished at the county fair all those years ago. His parents received the official confirmation in a quiet meeting at the sheriff's office. There were no cameras allowed, no microphones. Just the blunt, devastating truth spoken across a desk. Their son had been found. The news spread quickly, but instead of bringing relief, it reignited old wounds and questions that had never been resolved. Forensic teams pored over the items recovered alongside the body, the rusted bicycle lock, the torn strip of fabric, fragments of soil pressed against the bones. Each was logged, photographed, and sent for specialized testing. Early analysis suggested the boy had never left the fairgrounds at all. Everything pointed to him being attacked, killed, and buried within hours of disappearing. The fact that he had lain there unnoticed while hundreds of people searched only yards away was something investigators struggled to comprehend. Forensic anthropologists examined the skeleton in detail. Certain bones showed fractures that were not the result of time or soil pressure, but of blunt force trauma. The injuries suggested he had been struck hard, possibly more than once, with something heavy. The blows had been catastrophic, strong enough to cause death. Beyond that, however, the evidence offered little certainty. The shallow burial indicated haste, but the choice of location, so close to the crowds in a place certain to be walked upon, was confounding. Why would someone hide a body where discovery seemed almost inevitable? Unless, investigators reasoned, the killer had been counting on the chaos of the fair, the constant resurfacing of the lot to keep the secret hidden. Soil analysis provided small but frustratingly incomplete clues. Samples taken from beneath the remains suggested they had been disturbed around the time of the fair, then covered over before the ground hardened again. Trace materials, tiny flecks of paint, bits of glass, were found embedded in the dirt around the bones, but none were unique enough to identify a specific source. The torn piece of fabric was even more maddening. Forensic specialists could not conclusively link it to the clothing he had worn that night. The color had faded too much. The weave was too generic. It was possible it had been his, or just as possible it had come from someone else altogether. The bicycle lock drew the most speculation. It was old, rusted nearly beyond recognition, but investigators wondered if it had been used as a weapon. Its weight and shape could have inflicted the kind of fractures found on the boy's skull. Yet without fingerprints, without DNA, there was no way to prove it. It remained an artifact of uncertainty, a piece of metal corroded by time, as enigmatic as the crime itself. The family attended meetings with detectives, listening to reports about bones and fractures, about soil layers and evidence markers. Each technical explanation was a knife twisted deeper. For years they had wanted answers, and now that answers had begun to surface, they were cruelly incomplete. Their son had not run away. He had not started a new life in another place. He had been killed and left in the dirt of the fairground, right where they had spent those frantic first nights searching. It was knowledge that broke them anew, a truth both clarifying and unbearable. The community was stunned. Theories multiplied as fast as they had in the early days of his disappearance. Some believed the carnival workers were responsible after all, that one of them had struck him in anger or malice and buried him before leaving town. Others argued it had to have been someone local, someone familiar enough with the fairgrounds to know where to dig. Why else bury him so close to home? The idea that his killer might still live among them deepened the unease, reopening fractures that time had only barely healed. For investigators, the case was both closer to resolution and further from it than ever. They had the boy's remains, but no suspect. They had evidence of trauma, but no murder weapon that could be tied definitively to anyone. The parking lot had given up its secret, but not the identity of the one who had placed him there. Detectives combed through old records, re-interviewed witnesses, and traced the movements of every carnival worker, every stranger reported that night. They uncovered nothing that fit neatly, nothing that explained how a teenager could walk into the shadows of a parking lot and never emerge. By the end of the forensic investigation, one conclusion stood clear. The boy had not vanished into thin air. He had been attacked, killed, and hidden, his body entombed in plain sight for over a decade. But the questions that lingered were heavier than ever. Who had struck the fatal blows? Why choose to bury him so close in a place so certain to draw attention? And how had the crime gone unseen by hundreds of people only feet away? The answers remained out of reach, leaving behind only bones, fragments, and the crushing certainty that someone had gotten away with murder. The confirmation of the boy's death was supposed to bring closure, but for his family, it felt like a cruel parody of it. They had spent 14 years imagining every possibility, every road he might have walked, every life he might have been living somewhere else. Now they knew he had never left the fairgrounds at all. His mother sat in his untouched room for hours after the news, staring at belongings that had gathered dust over more than a decade, finally forced to admit the boy who once filled the house with noise would never walk back through the door. His father stopped visiting the fairgrounds at night. There was no longer anything to search for. The discovery had ended the waiting, but left only grief sharpened into permanence. Investigators stood before the press and said what the family already knew in their hearts, that foul play was the only explanation. The fractures in his bones, the shallow grave, the items buried alongside him, none of it suggested an accident. Someone had struck him, killed him, and hidden his body within feet of where his parents had called his name into the night. Yet identifying who had done it was another matter entirely. 14 years had erased witnesses, scattered carnival workers, and buried memories under layers of uncertainty. Many of those who had worked the fair were long gone, their names forgotten, their faces faded from memory. Detectives admitted privately there was little hope of finding them now. Theories once again filled the vacuum of silence. Some clung to the idea that a carnival worker had been responsible, a transient who had taken advantage of the chaos before disappearing forever. Others suspected someone local, someone who had lived with the secret all this time, perhaps even attending the vigils, perhaps even parking their car above the very grave they had dug. The possibility that the killer had blended back into daily life made neighbors eye each other with unease once again. Old suspicions reignited, but without evidence, they were nothing more than shadows. For the family, the years of suspicion from the community had already taken their toll. Even now, with his remains recovered, some whispered that the boy had chosen to leave and had simply met a tragic end by chance. Others speculated that his parents knew more than they admitted, though investigators never found reason to suspect them. The cruel rumors refused to die. Grief was not enough. They had been forced to endure judgment, and now they were left with the bitter truth that the judgment would never really stop. The town, too, carried the weight. Every summer when the fair returned, the story resurfaced. Parents told their children not to wander off, using the boy's name as a warning. Teenagers dared each other to walk to the far edge of the parking lot at night, whispering about the shadows where he was last seen. Vendors who set up stalls heard fragments of the story retold, twisted by time but never forgotten. The fair had once been a symbol of joy, of small-town life at its brightest, but now it was inseparable from the memory of loss. In official terms, the case was closed as unsolved. The file remained in storage, labeled and preserved, but detectives acknowledged there was nowhere left to go. Without suspects, without living witnesses, and without conclusive physical evidence tying anyone to the crime, the truth of that night would remain locked away forever. It was a conclusion that satisfied no one, least of all the family who had waited half their lives for an answer. They had received only the knowledge of what had happened, not why, not how, and not who. Years later, the boy's story was still told at every county fair, not as gossip, not as rumor, but as a grim reminder of how quickly joy could turn into tragedy. Parents recited it to their children the way others might tell a cautionary tale, a way of explaining why they should never stray too far, never step into the shadows alone. The boy who once blended into crowds had become a legend of absence, his fate sealed not only in the soil of the fairground, but in the collective memory of a town that could never forget. Though his remains were recovered, the truth of that night remained buried deeper than any grave. The fair would keep coming, lights flashing, rides spinning, music echoing across the fields. But behind it all lingered the silence of a question that would never be answered. Who led a boy into the shadows, and why did no one see? It was a mystery left to hang in the air forever, carried on with each passing summer, etched into the very ground where the crowd had once cheered and where a teenager's story had ended unseen.